Alright, so we're going to start by opening up to our table of contents. We have a new unit to add. This is going to be Unit 10 in our table of contents. It is SOL 6.5, and this is going to be kind of a large unit. We're going to cover both various forms of calculating fractions and decimals in this unit. So we're just going to write fractions and decimals. When we add our titles on our pages in our notebook, we'll be a little bit more specific as far as what operations and what types of problems we're dealing with. But in our table of contents, just write SOL 6.5, fractions and decimals. Alright, now if you flip to the next page of your notes, you're going to start by writing that number 10 in the corner because it is Unit 10 in our table of contents. We're going to title it with the SOL number. Now more specifically, this is SOL 6.5a, so we will add that to the title here, and it's going to be Modeling Multiplication of Fractions. So we started out with multiplying a whole number times a fraction. So that's actually where I'm going to start with today. I'm going to say multiplying a whole number times a fraction. You might have, for example, you might have 2 times 1/3. And what that really means is, we said yesterday you have two groups of 1/3, or you have 1/3 2 times. We'll write 2 groups of 1/3. So if I were to model that, then we drew like a rectangle that we divided into thirds, and we shaded in 1/3. And then we drew another rectangle, could be next to it, could be below it. We divided that into thirds, and again we shaded in another third. So 2 groups of 2/3, if I total the number that I have shaded, then I would have 2/3 shaded in. And if it was something where I had an improper fraction, we did our grouping in order to make it a mixed number, or we simplified if possible. This example is pretty simple because there's no simplifying, there's no improper fractions. It's just showing how we took a whole number times a fraction and how we translated that into a model. I'm going to slide this up, and then we're going to do some examples now with multiplying 2 fractions together instead of a whole number times a fraction. And I'm going to do some examples down below. So the first example that I'm going to do is going to be 1/2 times 1/4. So if I kind of look at how we translated the multiplication problem up top, that would mean a half of a group of a fourth, or half of 1/4. 1/2 times 1/4 means a half of 1/4. So what we would do is we would draw a rectangle that gets divided into fourths. Now to make this easy to draw with our line paper, you can follow my model here. I'm going to take up 2 lines of paper because it will just make it easy for me to divide it up the way I want to in a second. All right, so if I'm taking half of a fourth, that would mean I'm going to divide this rectangle into fourths. And I would shade in 1/4. So this is starting with my 1/4. But if I want half of a fourth, the way I would show that is I would now divide up my rectangle the other direction. So I'm going to split it in half going the other way. And then I would shade in the half of the rectangle. And then what I'm looking at here is if I want half of a fourth, basically I have shaded a fourth and I've shaded a half, kind of dividing the rectangle the other direction. And I'm looking at where they overlap, okay? And I'm looking at, instead of counting up how many thirds I have shaded in here, I'm looking at what this is divided up into now. Well, now, because I have kind of overlaid the half and the fourth kind of on top of each other on that rectangle, this is now divided up into eighths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, okay? And then I'm going to look at what fraction of those eighths is overlapping twice, okay? Where my shading overlaps, where the shading is twice, okay? So this indicates the half of the fourth that I was trying to model is where I've actually kind of turned my pen the other direction when I did the shading so that you could kind of see where they crisscrossed. So I have one box of these 8 where it is overlapping. And so that dark area, sometimes they have like different shades of gray basically, and where it's darker is where the 2 shades of gray are overlapping. Or if you're kind of turning your pen to show the lines at different angles, or sometimes you could use different colors. If you're taking a test on the computer, or if we are using IXL, something on a computer screen that's in color, sometimes they will do 2 different primary colors, and where the 2 colors kind of overlap, that is going to be your answer. So you can draw the model to help you answer the problem. So the answer to 1/2 times 1/4, or 1/2 of 1/4, is 1/8. That's our answer. All right, I'm going to slide this up. I'm going to kind of skip a line, and then I'm going to do my second example here. So my second example is going to be, I'll use a half again this time. I'm just trying to use easy fractions that are easy for you guys to follow along with and copy in your notes. So I'll do 1/2 times 1/3 this time. Or that would mean 1/2 of a third. All right, so same thing, since I am going to eventually be dealing with a half here, it will be easy if I draw my rectangle taking up 2 lines, because I know I'm eventually going to cut it in half, not right away. All right, I'm going to start by shading in a third. I want 1/2 of a third, so I'm going to start by shading in a third of my rectangle. And again, if I want 1/2 of that third, I'm going to split my rectangle in half the other direction. I'm going to shade in that 1/2, and I'm going to look at where those 2 shaded regions overlap. So I could say that 1/2 times 1/3, if I write that original problem down, is equal to, and I look at how many sections this has created now. Okay, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sections, and I look at how many are like overlapping, where it's shaded in twice. And again, in this instance, I only have 1 of those 6 sections that is overlapping or shaded in both directions, shaded in twice. So 1/2 times 1/3 is equal to 1/6. All right, and then my third example will be the last one on this page here. And this time I will do 2/3 times 1/2. Or that would mean 2/3 of a half. All right, to draw my rectangle this time, I am going to go draw 3 lines down. All right, and I'm going to, this will actually look a little bit more like a square. I'm going to start by splitting it in half. Okay, basically I'm starting with my second fraction. I want 2/3 of a half, so I have to start by shading in a half. It doesn't matter which half you shade in, as long as I shade in half. I'm going to shade in the left half on mine. Okay. Then I want 2/3 of a half. Well, in order to show 2/3, this is why I use 3 lines on my paper, is I have to divide this now in 2/3 the other direction, but shade in 2 of the thirds rather than just 1/3 like I did up top. I can shade in the bottom 2/3 like I did in the first 2 examples. I shaded in the bottom row. Just to show that I can switch things up here, I will this time shade in my 2 top rows. So I'm going to shade in 2/3 starting at the top this time. And again, I've kind of turned my pen the other direction so that I can really see where the shading overlaps, because it will actually create these little crisscross lines, okay? So now I'm going to rewrite my problem here. I had 2/3 times 1/2, or 2/3 of a half, right? And I am looking at how many sections this has created. So actually, like the one up top, it's created 6 sections, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's my denominator. Of those 6 that it created, I have these 2 right here that are overlapping. Okay, so those 2 that's going to be my numerator. Okay, because of the 6 boxes that this model has created, 2 of them are overlapping. So that would be my answer. Again, your answer is where they crisscross, where they're overlapping. It's the darker section. If it's just using gray instead of these crisscross lines, that's my answer. Now, the only thing that I have to worry about here is this is not simplified. We talked about that already a little bit. So since these are both even numbers, I could divide both numbers by 2. And so 2 divided by 2 would give me 1. 6 divided by 2 would give me 3. And so my final answer here would be 1/3. So I could conclude from this that 2/3 times 1/2 is equal to 1/3. And I use that model to help me draw the picture, so I could come across my answer. I just had to simplify it after I used the model to help me arrive at that answer.